Hello, I'm the chairman of the Education Committee here at the Jenks Center, and I bring in 2 programs every month, and I'm glad to see you have come. I'd like to ask you to shut off your cell phones or other electronic devices if they're on. Melody Wing is here from WinCam, and she's going to take this program. And if you know anybody that wanted to come tonight and didn't get here, they can watch it on Channel 8 or Channel 9. I don't know how soon it will be on, but it will be on. Speaking about family history and her book called The Journey to the Educational Foundation. And we're very lucky to have a grant from them because we wouldn't have these programs without them. Leslie Albrecht Huber's ancestors were journey takers, leaving their homes in Germany, Sweden, and England, leaving them behind to sail to the U.S. and start new lives here. Huber set out to trace these journeys and to understand her family, who they were, and what mattered to them. But as she followed in their footsteps, walking the paths they walked and looking over the land they farmed, she found herself on a journey she hadn't expected. Based on thousands of hours of research, Huber recreated the immigration experience in a way that captures both its sweeping historical breadth and its intimately personal consequences. For more information on the book or on tracing immigrant ancestors, visit her website at www.understandingourancestors.com or www.thejourneytakers.com, or you can follow her blog at www.thejourneytakers.blogspot.com. Her book is here on the table, and she will be happy to sign any copies that you would like to buy after the program, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Huber.
Okay, well, we have a nice, intimate little group here. So the good part of that is that if you have a pressing thought or question in the middle, don't feel like you have to wait till the end. Go ahead and raise your hand and ask a question or share your thought. We have a small enough group to do that. So today, our topic is writing a page-turning but true family history. Now, I think that most of us at some point in our lives, as we consider the information, the stories that we have about our families, we develop the desire to share it with others in our family. We want them to be able to learn the things that we have learned and to be able to connect to our family the way that we have. Perhaps the most effective way to do this is with a well-written family history. The most effective way to ensure that these stories are not lost and that they continue on in our family and are distributed and reach the people that they would matter to. Now, if you're like me, you've probably read quite a number of family histories already. And it's been my experience that most family histories tend to fall into one of 2 categories. In the first category, we have the family history that begins something like this. My great-grandmother was born in Fremont, Utah on August 18, 1890. And the whole rest of the family history reads basically like that. So what it is a listing of details strung together in paragraph format. Now, it might have all kinds of wonderful, accurate, detailed information, but nobody will ever know because they've all fallen asleep by the end of the first page. Now, the second type of family history that you may have come across is very different. This type of family history is dramatic, it's exciting, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And the characters in it have a slight resemblance to the actual people in the person's family. So they have taken quite a few literary liberties, and often you find books like this in the fiction section. Now, I would imagine that probably most of us, our end goal, we hope, does not look like either of these types of family histories. So is it possible to write a family history that is both engaging and informative? Well, it is. That's why we're here tonight, to talk about how we can do that. And we're going to be going through a step-by-step process of how you can write your family history. And I'm going to be using some examples and some of the lessons learned from writing my book, The Journey Takers, that came out just last summer. Now, I think that for most of us, when we think about writing a family history, we think about sitting down on our computer and starting to type, right? This is the first thing that comes to our mind. But actually, this will be step, 4 or 5 here on my list of steps here tonight. Instead of starting out with writing, we have to start out a few steps before that. And the first step I think that's important in putting together our family history is forming our vision. And by that I mean having an idea of where we're going with this, what we're doing. And the first thing that we need to do is to select our subject and scope. Some people, when they think of writing their family history, they think that they need to include everyone on their family tree from themselves back to Adam and Eve on every single family line. Well, such is not the case. Instead, you could choose to write a biography about just one person in your family. You could write an autobiography, and in fact, I would encourage all of you to write an autobiography to tell the story of your own life. You could write the story of one family group. You could do the descendants from one particular ancestor, so tracing forward a couple of generations. The ancestors of one particular person, going back a certain number of generations, not necessarily to Adam and Eve, maybe back to 4 generations. The female or male only, most people become interested in their family name. They trace the male line in their family, but you could think outside the box and trace the female line back in your family. Or if you have a family, for example, that was immigrants, a nice way to do it is to tell the story of the family in that particular place. Maybe the family in Germany, the family in Sweden, or if they moved around, you could focus on a certain geographic area that they lived in. The point is, though, to remember that completing a 20-page family history will have more value to your family than intending to write a 200-page family history. So the point here is not to bite off more than you can chew, right? We all have different demands on our schedules, on our time. It is not necessary that we complete a volume like this in order to have done something valuable for our family. And writing just a couple of pages about your family will be very important instead of having a project that is so large that you are intimidated and overwhelmed and never actually do it. Next, I would encourage you to think about the format that you are aiming at. So some other options that you might consider. We're talking about written family histories tonight, but there are other ways to do this. You could, for example, put together a family cookbook. Probably some of you have seen these that don't just include recipes, but also include stories that relate to food. We all like stories that have to do with food, don't we? Food brings up such wonderful memories for us. So you might have a recipe of your grandmother's rolls, and then someone who's written an essay about what it was like making these rolls with grandma, or collections of information like this. Another option is a scrapbook. A scrapbook would include things also such as photos or documents. Now, when I was in high school, it was all the rage to do scrapbooks, and we all used rubber cement and pasted them on the paper. I am not an expert in preservation, but I do know enough to know that rubber cement is not the family historian's friend, right? So do look into preservation techniques when you're putting together these wonderful pieces of information. Another option is collection of letters or documents. My mother, for Christmas this past year, gave each of her 4 children, including me, a printout of all the letters that she had written back to her family when we were little. So she had lived out of state, they had been in graduate school, and every week, there was no email then, right? In some ways that's good, because people then actually wrote, printed the letters and sent them instead of push send and then they're gone. That she had saved these letters and she gathered them together, and so we have the story of our lives from every week, just about a page or 2, and she put these all together and gave them to us. And even when we were teenagers, we'd sit around sometimes and read the letters and, laugh at some of the things that we had done. Some other things to consider. It's important to make decisions at the beginning, but to be flexible. So, a little bit about how I approach this with the journey takers. When I first thought about what I wanted to do, I came at it from maybe a slightly different perspective in that my aim was not necessarily to write a family history for my family. I hoped my family would read it and benefit from it, but all along I was writing for a broader audience. I wanted to tell the immigration story in a way that would appeal to anyone who had immigrants or anyone who was interested in the immigration story, and to use the story of one family placed in their historical context to get that broader picture. And so I approached it from that tactic, which certainly shaped some of my decisions a little bit. But I decided I was going to tell a story from Germany, from Sweden, and from England. The book has 4 parts, and then the last part is when they come together in the U.S. So I began to gather this information and to tell the stories of these families. And that's the decision I made at the beginning, and I'll tell you how that worked out. But we make those decisions up front, but of course we have to be flexible, because we all know as we get going in a project, often our vision that we formed in the beginning gets changed a little bit, doesn't it? At the beginning, you might want to think about length. Are you looking for a 20-page history or a 200-page? You might start out with a 20-page and end up with something much more, or you might think you're going to do something longer and end up with something much less, but it's good to have a goal you're aiming toward. Now, not everyone who writes a family history needs to have a result that looks like this, right? You don't need to have a published and bound book. There's also lots of other ways to put it together. You might just put papers collected in a binder in sheet protectors. You might just have them spiral bound at Kinko's or Staples. They can easily take your papers and put them together in a book that way. Or you might just print out the pages from your computer and staple them up in the corner, and there you go. Remember, though, there is no one right way to do this. So be open-minded and find something that works for you. So now, as I was writing The Journey Takers, I worked on it for many years, and finally I had finished it. I had this finished product, and I began to give it to other people to read in my writing group and some friends and some editors, and to look over it myself, and I realized that it wasn't working. What I had put together was bogged down, we could say. I felt like it was a flower garden, and there really were flowers in there. I knew there were, but there were so many weeds that I was having a hard time seeing the flowers. I had too many details, too many people, too many dates, too many places. And remember, I wasn't just aiming at a story for my family, where maybe that would have been more appropriate, but I did want an overall narrative in the story. And so I went through and did some editing. And in this editing, I cut 50,000 words from my manuscript, 1/3 of the entire manuscript. And when I give this lecture to genealogy societies, this look of horror comes over their face when I say that. And people come up afterwards and say, "What did you do with those 50,000 words?" Well, I saved them. I still have them on my computer. But you know what? The book is better without them. It is a much clearer and cleaner story. So I did have to adjust my vision as I went through this process. So the next step after you have formed your vision is to gather your information. What this boils down to is that if you want to write an interesting story, you have to have interesting information to use to write it, don't you? Now, I have a whole 1-hour lecture, a separate one, that focuses on what we're going to cover in the next 5 minutes. So hold on tight, here we go, Ray. There's a lot that could be said. The first thing I would encourage you to do when you're working with genealogy documents, and people from a long time ago, is to use the basic records fully. So most of us, to gather our family stories, we start out with very predictable sorts of papers. We use the censuses, we use vital records, we gather births, marriages, and deaths. And these pieces of paper, they form the skeleton of our family, right? And that allow us to see the very basic flow of what happened. But I think sometimes we get into a hurry just to pull out those dates and places, to fill them in our little family group charts and our pedigree sheets. And we don't notice what gems might be hidden inside those records. So I encourage you to look beyond just the names, dates, and places and see what you might find. You can pay attention to things such as death, causes of death, occupations, and I always need to put a little gold star by occupation. This is a very important piece of information about our family that is in many, many records and is often overlooked. When we understand our ancestors' occupation, now sometimes it's a thing we've never heard of, right? And we'll have to do a little bit of follow-up research to really make sense of it. But once we understand it, we have some sense of what our ancestors did every day, what their daily routine was like. We also have some sense of their socioeconomic standing just by understanding their occupation. Now here is an old German parish record. My background is in German genealogy, so I get really excited when I see old German parish records. My husband says, that is so strange. There's no one else in the whole world who gets really excited about these old scribbly papers. But this is a marriage record, and this is an extra exciting record, by the way, because it is packed full of information. It has those dates and places that I need for my chart, but it has a whole lot more. So in the first column, it has the date they got married. The next column is the bands. They would read marriage bands for 3 weeks before the wedding. Then we have the name of the bride and the groom, and it also has their birth dates and places in the marriage record. Then we have the father of both the bride and the father of the groom, whether or not they're living, and what their occupation is. Right here above the groom's name, we have the word Steinhauer. Anyone familiar with German? Bricklayer or a mason. So this is his occupation. I did a little bit of research. What was it like to be a Steinhauer, to be a bricklayer in this time period? Well, I learned about the guild system, how they had come in as apprentices, and then they had advanced to journeymen and then to masters. And I read about how the guild system was disintegrating at this time, and so hardly anyone advanced to a master and what that meant for their lives. And I was able to learn a lot about my ancestor by doing a little research on this one word. And also, I love when the parish pastor or the whatever county clerk, whoever the record keeper was, adds little extra notes. This one isn't all that exciting. It just tells me that the family is living in Zusau and they will soon be moving to Wismar. But you can find all sorts of little pieces of editorial comment sometimes in the margins of the record. So if you get fortunate enough to see those, be sure and pay attention to them. So look for the types of records also that don't just have names and dates. Yes, ma'am?
How could you ever read that? I can't figure out one thing it says, or not except a few names. I think
It's not as hard as it looks. The first time I ever looked at a German parish record, I said exactly what you're saying. I said, I will never be able to read this. But the good thing is, these records are kept in table format, right? So they're very specific columns. And so when you become familiar with the way they're laid out, you'll know that the date is always in that column. And you know that the groom's name is always in that column. And so I was able to put those pieces together. Now, at the time I spoke German. I don't speak much German anymore. But I was able to trace my Swedish ancestors without speaking any Swedish. So you don't have to become fluent. You do have to get used to the old script. And having that by the side can help you. It does look like scribble at first, doesn't it? So records with more than names and dates. If you are writing about someone relatively recent, it is very helpful to use personal accounts, such as letters, journals, or interviews. If you do them, if you have anything in their words, these are treasures, aren't they? If there's anyone alive today who knew them, interview them, talk to them, find out what this person, what this family was like, what their personalities was like. If you have any letters that they wrote back and forth, this can also give you those great insights. Then use what I've called unconventional records, such as pension records, minutes of meetings, employment records, school records. You won't find these for all of your family, right? Not every single person will have these, but it's worth looking for because they are so helpful when you do find them. Another thing I would encourage you to look at, I don't have on here, are newspapers. I imagine that some of you have had the experience of reading old newspapers, right? And even if you don't find your family's name in the entry, they are so fun because they really give you a sense of what that community was like. And so by reading that, especially if they lived in a small town, if they lived in New York City, I don't know if that's going to give you that inside little glimpse there, but if they live in some little tiny town, then the newspaper is going to include when their daughter came to visit them. And it's going to include what happened at the local society meeting down the street, and the scandal of the church, and all these kinds of things that really tell you what their community is like. Now here's just some examples of types of outside the box records. This is what's called a Hausberg-Dokumenten. It's a German record that shows inheritance. So inheritance records can be really useful. And it shows the property passing from one person in the family to the next. It doesn't give me new names or dates that I didn't know before, but it has a detailed description of the property and the hierarchy of the family, who was going to inherit it in which order. One of my very favorite types of record to use are probate records. Now, some people think that probate records only exist for the wealthy, and that's just not the case. My ancestors were not wealthy, but many of them have probate records. And this is a probate record from Sweden, and it lists every single thing that the family owned, down to the color of stripes on their bed sheets, down to the number of fasteners on the wife's coat, the color of her headscarves. Now, speaking of reading it, this was beyond my level, right? I could get by on the Swedish church records, but I did hire someone to help me with this. So I hired a woman from the Swedish archive, and she sent me back a translation of this record, because not only was it in old script and in Swedish, but it was also a very archaic and specific kind of vocabulary that I think even if I had known Swedish, I would have struggled. Next, find records to create the context. I think of our families as being part of a painting, right? They are the center figures in this painting, but we do not want just a plain white background behind them. We want a rich background that shows what exists around them. So find out about the historical context. Read political and social histories. I started out when I was researching my Swedish ancestor by buying a book called Sweden, A Nation's History. I didn't know very much about Swedish history. I studied German history in college, and so I became familiar with the major events that were going on in Swedish history. Again, I think of my husband who was like, who else buys a book called Sweden, A Nation's History and reads it from cover to cover as if it was a page-turning mystery? Look for local histories such as town or village histories. And these can really be fabulous. Many places in the U.S. have county histories. You gotta take them with a grain of salt because they had ulterior motives, we could say, in getting themselves in the county history and often presented the best face forward. But contacting the local community and asking the local historical society or church if there is a local history available will often reap benefits. Then read accounts written by others that describe events your ancestors experienced. So even if your ancestors didn't leave behind a description of their lives, which unfortunately is the case for most of our ancestors, isn't it? My family, there are very few of them who left personal accounts. So if I can't find something that my ancestor wrote about the immigration experience, I can find things that other people wrote personally about the immigration experience. And that gives me some sense of the emotion and the reality of this experience by reading their reactions, their feelings, their experiences. So here's an example. My Swedish ancestor, Kersti, she wrote nothing. Not one word that she wrote has survived. However, someone making the immigration experience, journey with her did write some memories of it. Her name was Alma Felt Minor, and she wrote about landing in Castle Garden, which, by the way, if you're not familiar, Castle Garden was the arrival port in New York prior to 1892. 1892 was when Ellis Island opened. So Castle Garden opened in 1855, and about 80% of people arriving to U.S. ports in this time period were arriving at Castle Garden. And Alma Felt Minor wrote about it like this. She says, Castle Garden was a dumping ground for all kinds of cargo, and it was also crowded with immigrants. The floor was greasy and dirty. Here we had to make our beds on the floor, as did all the other immigrants. Mother spread out the quilts and bedding, and we all lay down in a row, the children and mother and father. And of course, every time I read this, I think that my ancestor was most likely sleeping on that same greasy and dirty floor just a little further down the row. A few extra hints. Keep track of sources as you go and keep them organized. Keep track of where you're finding this information. And I just want to tell you a little horror story to make you motivated, right? Don't we all get motivated by other people's blunders? So here's my blunder. So when I was putting together the Journey Takers, I decided I wasn't going to use footnotes or endnotes, okay? Now, that may seem like a ridiculous decision now, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. I decided I was going to use chapter notes because I wanted to appeal to a broad audience, and I didn't want it to get bogged down with a lot of specific references. And so I decided I kept track of all the sources I used, but just generally. I wrote that I got information about, I'm not sure if it's working, but I got information about infant mortality rates from this book, but I didn't put, from this book and this book, I didn't put exactly what statistic I got and on what page number. Because that's how chapter notes work, right? You say information from this chapter came from these sources on these topics. So that's the way I kept my notes. Well, as I got further on in the process and as I began to work with my editor, it became apparent that there was a flaw in my thinking and that I needed footnotes, because the type of audience that my book was going to appeal to would most likely be people who were also interested in the immigration experience. And they may very well want to know more about very specific things in there, and they would want to be able to go to the exact source for that exact piece of information and read about it. So, I had to put footnotes in backwards, right? The book was written. So my dear husband, who's a professor of chemical engineering at University of Massachusetts, had to order back in, or I ordered them, every single book I had ever looked at to write the Journey Takers. So he would go up to the library and come home with stacks and stacks of books, and the librarian was like, "What is it that you study? Why are you getting all these weird historical books all bound together with rubber bands that no one else has ever looked at ever?" And I had a stack in my bedroom about knee-high that covered about a quarter of my bedroom, it's a small bedroom, of books that I had to go back through. It was a nightmare. It took me months, and I had to delete a number of quotes and statistics because I could not find exactly where I had got them. So, please, don't follow my example. It's always easy to not use the information later if you have too much information. Keep the sources, keep the notes, and it'll make your life so much easier. My other hint is stop looking for that one last piece of information. Make a deadline for yourself to start writing. Whenever I give this talk, I have people who come up and say, "I am going to write my family history. I just got to find one more thing." Or they'll say, I really want to write my family story. I just have to find everything about this family first. You're never going to find everything. There's always going to be one last piece of information. So just decide, I am going to start writing my story, my grandmother's story, whoever, at this point, and follow with that. Or we'll spend all the rest of our lives thinking about that one last piece of information that we're going to find, and we'll never get around to actually writing it. So our next step is to shape your story. So you've gotten your vision, you've gathered all this information. What are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to figure out your storytelling method. How are you going to present the information? Maybe you're just going to tell it from the beginning to the end in a straightforward chronological manner. That is absolutely fine. Maybe you want to be a little bit more creative. I just wanted to give you a couple of other ideas. You may interweave your journey of discovery with your ancestors' lives, and this is the way that my book has been done. So mine is a parallel journey of my ancestors' journey and my personal journey as I follow in their footsteps, literally traveling to Germany, Sweden, and England. But also as I go from being a 21-year-old college student to being a mother, and as I learn about their experiences, it affects me and changes my view of the world and my view of my family and my role as a mother. And so I interweave my own thoughts and experiences with their story. And one benefit of this is it allows you to put emotion and reactions into a story without fictionalizing it, because you are the expert on your own feelings and emotions, so you don't have to worry about crossing that line into fiction. You might flip through documents and consider your ancestors' life at various points. I wrote a little short story doing that once. If available, intermix your ancestors' own words, or the actual words from others who interviewed about the person. There is nothing that can substitute for their voice, is there? We can retell what they said in a more politically correct way or in a more scholarly manner, certainly, but we can't replace their voice. So if you have access to their voice, if they lived recently enough that you have that, include it. Let them speak. Let their voice come through in that work. Let other people's memories come through. It makes for a very powerful story. Be creative. If you have a different type of idea, don't be afraid to try it out and see how it works. Because remember, there is no one right way to do this. Next, I would encourage you to create an outline. Now, I'm not talking about dusting off those cobwebs and going back to middle school and remembering the Roman numerals and the letters. That's not, don't tell your grammar school teacher I said this, but I don't necessarily think that's really important. But it is important to have an outline to give shape and direction to our story. Think about how you're going to organize your material. Are you going to organize it chronologically? By family? If you're writing something that tells several different families, maybe you want a chapter for each family or a section for each family. By topic, often people will have a section about their childhood years, courtship and marriage, employment experiences, whatever. They have it labeled by topic within their life. How about geographic location? If your family moved, this is an easy way to organize it. Start out with a section in Germany, a section, the immigration experience, a section in New York, or whatever, following them as they physically moved. Write what you are ready to write. So I have written over 100 articles for a variety of magazines, and in every instance, I guess I should say that backwards, I have never once written an article from the beginning to the end. I just don't believe in that. I think that the number one reason for what we call writer's block is forcing ourselves to write something that we are not prepared to write. When we sit down to write our family history, I think that most of us have ideas in our mind that there are certain parts of the history that we're excited about, don't we? Maybe we did the research about this one story and we think it's really interesting. Or we remember our grandmother telling us about her wedding day, and we know exactly how we want to write that. But sometimes we say, you know what, that doesn't happen first. I have to start at the beginning. No, you don't have to start at the beginning. Write your grandmother's wedding day first, if that is what is inside you, if that is what the ideas are there for. When you have this outline, it allows you to jump around because you have the framework there and you can move within it. So when I write a magazine article, I try to come up with a framework first, and I write my section headings. Most magazines are divided by sections, right, within the article. So I put out my section headings, and then when I have an idea, I start to write that section. And sometimes I'll be in the middle of a sentence, and I'll be like, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. But you know, I just thought of how I want to start this article. I will stop in the middle of a sentence and go to the beginning and write that part. My book, the chapters were written in completely different order than they appear now. I always knew they would be in this order. It's not that I rearranged them, it's that I didn't write them in order. Now, does this create a few hiccups? Of course. You will have to go back through and smooth things over to make sure it all flows just so. But in the end, I think it will be so much better when you let your creative juices flow, so to speak, with the parts that you are excited about. Decide how to document. Now notice I did not say decide if you're going to document, because if you're going to write a family history that is going to be the most value to your family, then documentation is your friend, right? You have got to let people know where you got this information so that, number one, they can trust your history, and number two, they can go to the sources if they want to learn more. They'll know where you got your information. There are a variety of ways to format your documentation. You can use footnotes, which go at the bottom of the pages, right? And your computer can do it. You just put insert footnote, and it fixes it for you. You can do endnotes that go at the end of the chapter or the paper. I used endnotes in my book because I didn't want all the documentation right there on the page to be distracting. And you can use a bibliography. Now, I use an endnote and a bibliography because I like to have a bibliography. I like to have all the sources in one spot where I can go and see what the person used to do it. Now, within the genealogy community, there is hot debate, believe it or not, about documentation. And my opinion is that you should not lose sleep over whether or not the comma goes on the inside or the outside of the parenthesis. This is not going to be the deciding factor in how valuable your family history is to your descendants, right? Now, when I publish articles in scholarly journals, I have to have every comma on the right side of the parentheses, right? And with my book, I had an editor who literally has memorized the Chicago Manual of Style. That is her job. It gave me a whole new respect for editors. I thought that I was a pretty good editor. I realized I know nothing. So she went through and she fixed all the mistakes in my footnotes. But you know, when you're writing something with your intended audience to be your family, the important part here is that you are consistent in how you share your information, and that you include enough information that they could find it themselves if they would like to. So don't worry about the exact colon or semicolon, but do worry that you have all the information that someone else would need. And to help you along, there are two major sources that are used in the writing family history world, in the genealogy world, to help us. And first is the Chicago Manual of Style. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this. You may have used it in a workplace or in school a long time ago. This is maybe the most widely used documentation style, and it is applied into many different disciplines. And this is what I use. I am a Chicago Manual of Style believer. Now, in the genealogy world, there is another documentation format called Evidence Explained by Elizabeth Shown Mills. She's like the queen bee of the genealogy world. And she says, her point is that, so Chicago Manual of Style tells us how to document books and websites and papers, but people, when they do their family history, they use all sorts of weird sources that no one else in the whole world uses, right? So how do you document that my cousin found this letter and we're not sure who wrote it, but we think it was the second cousin and it was in the bottom drawer in her closet? How do you document that? Well, Elizabeth Shown Mills will tell you. She has all those kinds of strange sources. I don't know if she actually has how to find it if you found it in the closet, but you get the point. All those strange types of sources unique to genealogists. So when you are writing it, if you need help to format, think about these two books. You can probably check them out from the library. I own the Chicago Manual of Style and have never regretted owning it. You can also find some of the basic information online.
Did you make copies of the original materials so that you have the actual copies so someone can refer back to it?
So can you all hear his question? Do I copy the material? With the original records, I absolutely do, like with the parish records or the probate records. When it's a book that I just got from the library that I'm using to help me understand the context, you know, like about religion in Sweden or about the German guild system, I didn't copy those because those are easy enough for anyone to go and get themselves. But I think it is helpful with those original records that you can only get in some obscure archive to copy them. So all of this trouble, now, finally, we're going to start writing. We're going to write our family history. This is the fun part, right? I hope so. I think it's the fun part. I know some people think that they'd rather scrub their toilet than write, but I think writing's really fun. So, we have gathered all this information to create this theme. Now we're going to use it in our story. We're going to describe their setting, include things like colors, textures, smells. When we use our other senses, it really brings the story alive for people. It makes them feel part of it. Think about how the family interacted. Our expectations of family roles was very different, wasn't it? Think about including that in your story. What was expected of a mother, of a father, of a child was much different. We were just talking about this, what children did. Our children do almost nothing compared to what children in different generations did. What did they eat? I must just be interested in food, right? I love to learn about what my ancestors ate. When I was researching my Swedish ancestor, I learned that she ate potatoes and herring for one meal, and herring and potatoes for the next meal. So, not a very much of a varied diet. What historical events affected their lives? Our ancestors did not live in a vacuum, right? They were affected by what went on around them. My Swedish ancestor arrived in New York in 1861. What event do you think shaped her immigration experience as she crossed? The Civil War. It had a huge impact on her experience as they crossed Missouri, which was a civil war with itself, basically, and they had to board up all the windows because it was common for people to shoot at trains if they suspected that someone with sympathy to the other side was on board the train. They also tore up the tracks in some places. So this certainly affected her. What if your ancestors were Irish immigrants in the late 1840s? You're going to want to write about the potato famine, aren't you? If you missed the potato famine, you've missed what their lives were like, really. It's not always so obvious, but always there were historical events that shaped their experiences and their decisions. Put emotion in the story. I think that we will have a dry story if we have no emotion. Now, this can be a tricky thing because we don't want to create emotions that we don't know about, but I believe that by including no emotions, we are also not portraying the story accurately because our ancestors certainly did have emotions just like we do. And so we want to think about how we can put them in there. Now, if our ancestor was an immigrant, can we write that they boarded the ship and they watched their family shrinking in the distance, the tears rolling down their cheeks as their heart broke for their homeland? Well, you can't write that if you don't know that it happened, right? You can't create these emotional situations. So there are some ways, though, to make emotion part of your story without putting your book in the fiction section. First of all, take time to notice and describe emotional situations. So this record on the page is a clerical survey record from Sweden, and these were kept by the parish pastor. There are a lot of ways similar to census records. He would go around to each household and quiz them on their knowledge of Luther's catechisms. And as he did that, fortunately for us, he wrote down everyone in the household and some information about them. Now, when you look at this record, you probably notice 3 names are crossed out, right? So this is my Swedish ancestor. She's the second from the bottom, Kerstina. She went by Kersti. She was the 7th of her parents' 7 children. Now, these names are crossed out because that's what they did when someone passed away. So in January of 1847, Kersti lost her mother and her 2 sisters in a matter of weeks to typhoid fever. She was 3.5 years old. Now, did I tell you how Kersti felt? No, but you feel emotion just by understanding the situation. When we take time to describe what happened, to really point it out, then we get a sense of that emotion there. Describe your own emotions. And again, this is something that is a benefit of putting yourself in the story, because you can describe how you felt when you learned about something that happened to them. And perhaps most useful of all is to use the emotions and descriptions of others to form hypotheses of your ancestors' reactions. So you may not know how your ancestor felt as she set sail on the boat, but you can read what other people wrote. Other people did describe their feelings. They did write about the tears flowing down their cheeks and their heart breaking as they said goodbye to their family. You can quote other people and say, I don't know how my ancestor felt, but other people described it like this. And that gives you that personal feeling from somebody else. Which brings us to our next point, and that is to use generalizations and inferences, but use them carefully. With careful thought and research, you can predict how your ancestors felt or reacted in certain situations. The more research you do, the better you're able to do this when you understand what was going on around them. So you can quote or refer to others, then add that your ancestor may have shared this reaction. You can't say that they did, you don't know, but you can say they may have felt this way. You could give general statistics or circumstances and explain that your ancestor likely had similar experiences. And I would like to read just a little part from my book. Test out my glasses and see how well they work, right? Now, I'm not reading it because this is necessarily the perfect example of how this is done, but because I think it's useful for me to have some example of how things might be done. So I just want to read about one experience in my ancestors' lives. Now, this is my English journey taker, or my English immigrant. And his name was Edmund Harris, and he eventually came to the U.S. and married Kersti, my Swedish immigrant that I've talked about a few times. As I began to do some research about the family, I learned that he had been married before in England, and no one in our family knew about this. He had married a woman by the name of Eliza Barrett, and they had married in London. And they had lived in London for a while, and then they had been baptized into the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in 1849, and set sail for Australia. This was not the typical pattern, right? Most of them were going to Utah. But they set sail to Australia. And my ancestors wrote nothing that described their lives. And in all my searching, I was only ever able to find one personal description of them written by somebody else. And it was by someone who lived near them in Australia. He left behind a diary. And this is what he said about them. He wrote that Eliza was the dirtiest woman he had ever met, and that all Edmund did was, quote, walk around grumping and growling like a bear with a sore head. So how's that for the one personal description of my ancestors? When you go out searching for this, you gotta be open-minded. You never know what you're gonna find. But I want to read a little bit more. So they were living in Maitland, Australia, and they had 2 children there. And at the time the story takes place, their daughter was 2 years old. Her name was Maria, and their son was 6 months old, Lister. And they decided that they were going to come to Utah, come to Zion. And let's see, Eliza and Edmund probably began making preparations to go to America several years prior to 1855. Funding a trip like this presented a serious challenge for families like theirs who had limited financial resources. The ship passage cost approximately 24 pounds. Okay, now that's a detail. Does that mean anything to us? We have no concept of what 24 pounds was, right? In comparison, a storekeeper earns slightly more than 2 pounds a week. So when we can put it in something they can anchor on, that helps it to have meaning. Now they had decided to immigrate, and they were going to rely on what was called the Perpetual Immigration Fund, the PEF, where the LDS Church would basically loan money to immigrants to get to Utah, and then they would pay them back. But as it came time for them to leave, the LDS Church withdrew funds to Australia because it cost 3 times as much to get someone from Australia to Utah as it did from England to Utah. And they decided we'd rather pay for 3 people from England than 1 from Australia, so we're not going to give them any more money. So because of this, they decided that Eliza would go ahead with Edmund and Lister, but they didn't have enough money for the whole family to go. So Edmund would stay in Australia and continue to earn money and come later. This was a common pattern, wasn't it? Among many immigrants, part of the family would go, and the other part would earn money. So, let's see, on the rainy, windy, dismal afternoon of September 7th, 1855. Okay, so if I've used rainy, windy, dismal, am I using that for dramatic effect? Well, yes, but did I make it up? No, I found a record that told me that the afternoon was rainy, windy, and dismal. 56 passengers boarded the Julia Ann, their ship. Half of the passengers were members of the LDS Church. Benjamin Franklin Pond, an experienced seaman, served as the captain. The trip was to take 3 months, their final destination being San Francisco, California. From here, the Mormon passengers planned to continue on to Utah. Now I'm going to fast forward to their voyage here. From the start of the voyage, winds blew harshly, rocking the ship and causing terrible seasickness for the passengers on board. One of the passengers, Andrew Anderson, recorded that most people threw up after eating their first meal. Quote, my family and others were sick little or much all the time, he wrote. Now again, my ancestors wrote nothing, so I have used quotes from other people who sailed with them to describe what the experience was like. The passengers received some Indian cornmeal, evidently useful for upset stomachs. Despite illness, most of the Mormon passengers got along with one another. In these conditions, the days passed, each not much different from the one before. By October 4th, the ship had been at sea for nearly a month. Captain Pond spent the day steering through an area filled with threatening reefs. By the time nightfall arrived, it appeared that the danger had passed. Captain Pond appointed a lookout and went below to rest. The passengers began to settle down for the evening. Eliza probably went below to steerage with her children. I don't know exactly what Eliza did, but I know that in general, the passengers were going below to steerage. So I am assuming that she probably did that too. Perhaps she nursed her baby, sang to her daughter, or held her children close as she told them stories about Zion. Then a call came out, hard down the helm, with a noise so loud that it sounded like thunder. The Julia Ann crashed directly into a reef. And again, I found a record that described the sound that it made, a noise that it sounded like thunder. The consequences were immediate and disastrous. Captain Pond wrote, quote, I sprang to my feet, but my heart failed me, as I was nearly thrown upon the floor by the violent striking of the ship. The heavy waves pounded the ship sideways against the reef. The stern section lifted onto the reef, and the bow fell deep into the water. A large hole opened in the side of the ship, and the boom swung violently across the deck. The ship was not sinking, it was breaking into pieces. Even worse, there was no land in sight. Captain Pond, quote, instantly saw there was no hope for the ship and very little for the lives of those on board. The extent of the crisis soon became evident to all. not survivors throughout their lives. John McCarthy, someone on the ship with them, quote, saw mothers nursing their babies in the midst of falling masts and broken spars while the breakers were rolling 20 feet high over the wreck. The waves washed 2 young girls overboard. They were never seen again. Word soon came for everyone to gather in the cabin. Parents hurried below, pulling their children out of bed as they made their way there. Esther Spangenberg, another passenger, described, quote, mothers holding their undressed children in their arms as they snatched them from their slumbers, screaming and lamenting. Amidst this chaos, Eliza managed to get her children to the cabin with the others. Even in the cabin, water covered the deck and continued to seep in as waves pounded mercilessly against the ship. Esther Spangenberg wrote, quote, when I reached the cabin, the scene can never be erased from my memory. Mothers screaming and children clinging to them in terror. Furniture was torn from its lashings and all upturned. The ship was lying on her beam ends. And you see what I mean about using their quotes? There's no way I could paraphrase that, is there, in a way that was more powerful than the way that she wrote it, who saw herself. Meanwhile, the crew began to implement a desperate plan. One crew member swam to the nearby reef and attached a rope to it. Passengers then began to make their way, hand over hand, slowly and painstakingly to the highest part of the reef. Crew members assisted the passengers by carrying young children across the rope with them. As Captain Pond wrote, quote, the process was an exceedingly arduous one and attended with much peril. Even the relative refuge of the reef left the passengers chest deep in water and surrounded by sharks. The plan was not ideal, but it was their only chance for survival. The crew called passengers up from the cabin one by one to take their turn crossing to the reef, beginning with the women and children. In my mind, I can see Eliza. Now, this is a technique that I have used to paint the picture, so I'm telling you that I am departing from the actual facts and describing the way that I see the scene in my mind. Now, I'm basing it on the descriptions of the people there, but again, I don't know exactly what Eliza was doing, so I am just picturing it in my mind and describing it that way. In my mind, I can see Eliza. She stands in the cabin as water splashes all around her. The boat rocks and creaks violently from side to side, the darkness pressing down against her. Soaking wet and bruised from the debris falling wildly from the boat, Eliza keeps her children close as they wait for their turn to cross. Her clothes are nearly ripped to shreds. She holds Maria's arm tightly as the little girl clings desperately to her legs. Eliza realizes there is no way she can carry a baby and cross to the reef. She will need both hands to grip the rope. With deliberate carefulness, she lashes Lister across her chest, making sure it is as tight as possible. Someone calls Maria's name. The people below pass Maria up on deck and then to a crew member. Eliza watches anxiously, acutely feeling her own powerlessness. She waits, and she prays. The seconds seem like hours as the boat lurches and the water swells around her. At last, word comes back. Maria reached the reef safely. Eliza breathes a deep sigh of relief. From up on deck, she hears a crew member call her name. She is ready. She kisses Lister and whispers consoling words in his ear, almost as much for her own reassurance as for his. Then suddenly she hears someone calling, "Hold on all!" And then, quote, an awful sea struck the ship, tearing up the bulwarks, threatening death and destruction to everything within reach. The ship couldn't take the pounding it was receiving any longer. The Julia Ann broke in two across the hatch. Captain Pond described, quote, the sea had stove in the forward part of my cabin and washed away the starboard staterooms, taking with it 2 women and a child. The poor mother had lashed her infant to her bosom. Eliza and Lister were washed away and drowned. Now I flashed to my own experience, like I said before, I wove that in. Here in my bedroom, I remember reading Captain Pond's words for the first time. Several hours have passed since I started what I thought would be a quick preliminary search on the internet for information about the Julia Ann. Does that ever happen to you? You just look up something real quick, like 5 hours later, they're still there. Now I can't read any further. Captain Pond's words ring in my head. I get up and pace the floor. I want to tell someone, but there's no one to tell. It's 2 in the morning. Everyone is asleep. Why didn't anyone tell me, I wonder? But there was no one to tell me. No one alive today knew about the fate of Eliza Barrett Harris. I sit down at my computer and cry. I cry for their tragedy and for my lack of knowledge of it. And my husband says, get a grip, those people died a really long time ago. The thought that Eliza died 150 years ago does little to console me. Through the detailed time intimate and personal loss. Eliza isn't my blood relative. Remember, I'm descended from the second wife. If I were to meet her, I might even be repulsed. She was poor, ignorant, and dirty. Yet now I am bound to her. I know the last actions of her life. I sense her final thoughts and feelings, her most personal and vulnerable emotions. I feel her desperate love for her children. Despite the vastly different circumstances of our lives, we share something. If I had been on the Julian instead of her, I would have also clutched my daughter tightly and lashed my baby boy to my chest. I quietly open the door to my children's bedrooms and see them lying there peacefully, their backs rising and falling with each breath. Rachel, my daughter, is 2 years old. Taylor, my son, is 6 months old. I get into bed and think of Maria and Lester, Rachel and Taylor. And I still get emotional when I read that story. But that's what happens when we write these things. We become attached and connected to these people, don't we? So very briefly, we're going to finish up here. I encourage you to be sensitive as you write your family history, especially when you're writing about people who are still living. First of all, protect their privacy. Don't post online their social security numbers and mother's maiden name, right? Identity theft is a real issue. Be careful. But perhaps more relevant is to be tactful, but truthful. You don't need to make all your family be saints. But family history is perhaps not the place to reveal your family skeletons in the closet. And I'm not talking about things that happened 200 years ago, right? It's time for people to face the facts now. I'm talking about writing about things that affect people who are still living. We need to think about what we're doing. I knew a family well who the grandmother was becoming older and she wanted to write her life story. So she began meeting with her granddaughter and they put together this story. And as they were doing this, it came out that one of the aunts, one of the grandmother's daughters, had struggled a lot with mental illness in her 20s and in fact had been institutionalized for a while because of this. So the granddaughter wrote it right up in the family history. Now fortunately, her mother read it before it went out to the whole family and she called her sister and said, "This information is in the history. How would you feel about that?" And her sister said, "I would be absolutely devastated." She said, "My own children do not know about this yet." Is that the way for her children to find out? And all the cousins read it in the family history. So be careful about information you're sharing that affects living people. So you've written your family history, you're all done. No, you're not. Spend some time polishing your writing. Liven it up. Eliminate unnecessary words. Yeah, this is the hard part. This is the scrubbing the tiles with the toothbrush, right? Try choosing descriptive verbs instead of adding adverbs. Do you remember all these details from grammar class? So instead of he ran quickly to the door, he sprinted to the door. Find a word that says exactly what you mean. It doesn't have to be a fancy word, just a concise and clear word. Vary sentence structure. You'll recognize this as you read through. You don't want every sentence to start exactly the same. Replace passive verbs with active verbs. You know what passive verbs is, was, are. I always read things through just to eliminate passive verbs. Not all of them. Passive verbs aren't bad. We just overuse them. And instead of saying the family was found in the census, I found the family in the census. Have an action sentence. My editor has on her website George Orwell's 6 Rules on Writing, and these have kind of become my mantra. I love them. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech that you are used to seeing in print. So none of the, her eyes sparkled with mischief. Think of your own way to say it. Don't say what everyone else says. Never use a long word, where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. And I think this is important because when people first start writing, sometimes I think we have a mistaken idea that fancy, long, complicated sentences and words is better writing. The opposite is true, right? We want to have concise and clear writing. We want to choose words that say what we mean as simply as possible. Now, when we're choosing specific words, sometimes they're going to be neat and usual words because they're concise and specific words, not because we're choosing fancy things. Never use the passive, where you can use the active. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And break any of these rules sooner than saying anything outright barbarous. So there are no hard and fast rules for writing, right? Use guidelines and then do what works for you.
Where did you find those?
You can find them online if you Google George Orwell's 6 Rules in Writing. My editor's name was Christine Thornley, and she has them on her website. George Orwell's 6 Rules of Writing. Proofread. Read your finished history out loud. This forces us to slow down, which I just remembered that there's a typo on one of my slides coming up. How inappropriate when I'm talking about proofreading, right? And read your finished story out loud. This helps us to slow down and catch the mistakes that we just read over, because we know what we meant to say, right? But sometimes we don't notice that we didn't say what we meant to say. Ask a friend or family member to read the history. And people will say, oh, can't do that. I'm gonna have someone else read it. Why are you writing it if no one else is going to read it? It's time to let other people give you feedback. And this is what maybe is my main message of the whole night. Do your best writing when you write your family history. This is a place to make it count. Do the very best you can. But don't let fear of writing prevent you from writing your family history. You do not need to be a Pulitzer Prize winning author or an accredited genealogist to write a family history that will matter to your family, that will be treasured by your family. So even if adverbs and passive verbs and all of this makes your head swim, then forget it all and write your family history anyway. Put those stories down so that they will survive and continue in your family. And then share it. Let people know that this exists. Pass it out to your family, to your distant family members too, not just your brothers and sisters, but those if they want more information. I don't like to put my phone number online, although anyone can find it on white pages if they really want to. So think about what you're putting there, but maybe an email address or some way for them to get in touch with you. In conclusion, here are some resources. And here's my typo. With more information, some of you probably are familiar with Cindy's list. She has lots of information on writing your family history. There are several books.
Have some questions, I'll put the lights on.
No, I just had something I wanted to share, a little program that was about the library on researching her ancestry that I never really thought about, and which was that one of the best records is the marriage record, because the birth record is not the actual person giving that information, nor is the death record, obviously. And there's a lot of emotion with people giving that information, but the marriage record is the actual, the individuals telling.
You hope they know their own information.
Yeah. I know that was interesting.
Yeah, people have done genealogy research will often see death records where it asks for how old they are and nobody knows. So hopefully the people at their marriage know how old they are,
Yeah.
right? But the person who's deceased is not the one providing the information. And we are not primary sources for our own birth either,
Exactly.
only for our marriage.
Did you find a lot of your records at the Warner Library in Salt Lake City?
I found them in a wide variety of places. I was living when I was doing the German research, I lived in Utah, so I had lots of access to those. And the Swedish research, I was living in Wisconsin, and I often ordered those films into my local family history center from the Family History Library in Salt Lake. I did also go to the villages themselves, and that's where I got a lot of the village histories. I didn't get a lot of new documents there. I did get some, but there's so much here that's filmed. You don't have to go there to access it. Yes, sir.
Yes, now once one has finished, how does one put it together in a book form, which is not only attractive but serviceable?
Okay, that's a hard question. How do you put it together in a book format? Now, I have to confess that I had a graphic designer and an editor, so.
I'm sorry?
I had a graphic designer and an editor, so I didn't do that myself, right? For my book to look like this, people who know how to do it did it for me. And it depends on what your end goal is. If you do want something bound like this, you certainly can hire an editor or someone to do it in Microsoft Word or with obviously a fancier layout program to put in your pictures that way.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll just piggyback on that for a second. My name is Stephanie Stephanie Nichols, and I spoke here a couple of months ago about personal history, kind of another angle, a less researched angle, but telling your own story. And some of us have services, or I have a partner who does layout and design, and then we work with a bookbinder in Boston and can help people create. You can get very high quality bound books now in very small quantities because it's all digitized.
They're on demand, yeah.
It's much less expensive than it would have been impossible before.
Print
But now
20
you
copies
can,
instead of 1,000.
yeah, you can get very high quality in the smallest number that you want.
Yes,
You
ma'am.
mentioned probate. How far do those records go back?
It really varies depending on location. And let me just give everyone a resource that can help. And if you haven't used Family Search, FamilySearch.org, and they have a section. If you click on their Learn tab, and you can search. And I would encourage you to do this. Put in the name of the place you're looking in: Sweden, New York, Massachusetts, and it will provide you with a guide that it's divided by sections. So there's a section on probate. There's a section on immigration, there's a section on vital records, and so you can read what types of record exist for that place, because it is different for each place and each time period. So go to Family Search, it's all free, FamilySearch.org, click on their Learn tab, and do a search. You're actually searching their wikis, but wikis sometimes scare people. You don't even have to know that you're searching their wikis. Just type in their wikis. So are you familiar with Wikipedia?
Oh, yeah.
So Family Search has now changed their format so that it used to be they had these standard research outlines for each country, but they've opened them up to be wikis. And that just means that anyone can add information. And this is great because with the internet and so much new information coming on, they can be constantly updated by anyone in the community. So they're much more up to date than if you're just printing out that hard document.
What's the help tab, did you say?
Learn,
Oh,
the Learn tab at FamilySearch.org. Click on the Learn tab. That's my favorite little trick. Every time I'm doing research in a new area, that's the first thing I do. I go there and I get myself oriented with what the sources are for that place.
If you want that one, I mean, there seem like there's so many out there now, Ancestry.com. But you want this one?
Well, yes. Ancestry definitely has more records, right? But for a how-to, for a step-by-step, I think this is the best thing online for different places. You know, if you want to search in the census, go to Ancestry by all means. Also, this is free. Ancestry is not, right? Unless you go to your public library,
That's right.
if they have a subscription.
But you have to use it at the library.
Right. Yep, they're a profit company.
In using things like Ancestry, where what they've done is to take these written records and I guess they
Digitize them.
and they digitize them, it pays to be a little flexible about how things are spelled.
Oh, so
We're
true.
tracing Foster, for instance, and sometimes it would turn up that the F digitized as a P. So we found some of the stuff as Foster, and some of it as Fosler instead of Foster, and this sort of thing. It really got us off the track that we were looking for.
That's a very good point. It's very important to be open-minded in names, spellings. In fact, there's a quote, one of the most famous genealogy books is called The Source, and William Thorndale writes in it that perhaps the most common reason that people do not find their ancestors is because they fail to look for spelling variants. So something very simple, they're looking in the right record for the right person, but they don't see them because they haven't taken into account. Sometimes it's an error, like the P and the F, but often it's also the simple fact that our ancestors spelled phonetically based on how things sounded. They were not obsessed with spellings like we are, so it didn't matter to them if it was, Harris with one R or two R's, one S or two S, and E at the end. It doesn't matter as long as it's pronounced the same. So yeah, excellent point. Thank you for raising that. All right. Thank you all very much.
Look at the book. Feel free to come and ask questions.